Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today's episode is somewhat autobiographical in that I'm going to talk about my journey of learning how to hear from God. For most of my Christian life, I didn't know it was possible to hear from God. I didn't know that God talked to his children on a regular basis, and so I didn't take time to listen. Not because I didn't want to hear from God. I mean, there was nothing I wanted more. I just didn't know that it was possible. And in 2015, this all changed for me. I began to learn how to hear from God. Today's episode is about the process, and it is a process, the process of learning how to hear from God. Season 2 of the podcast is drawing to a close. We have 2 more episodes after this one. And if Season 2 has been helpful to you, please consider making a donation to support the podcast. You can do that by going to adamyoungcounseling.com and clicking on Support the Podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Let me begin with a plea for a hearing. Samuel Williamson wrote a book a few years ago called Hearing God in Conversation, which is such a lovely title. And he says something in the beginning of that book that really got to me. And this is what he says. He says, "My parents taught me that we were redeemed in order to have a restored relationship with God. And the basis of every real relationship is communication. God saved us to have a conversational relationship with him." Samuel Williamson. And when I first read that, I couldn't find any holes in the logic. It all just seemed so true, and yet it seemed too good to be true. Here's what he's saying. He's saying, my parents taught me that we were redeemed in order to have a restored relationship with God. Check. That seems true. And then he continued, the basis of every real relationship is communication. I couldn't argue with that. I mean, it's just true. The basis of every real relationship is communication. And so I'm sitting in my chair having read that sentence, and I'm like, if God redeemed me so that I could have a real relationship with him, and if the basis of every real relationship is communication, then maybe God intends for me to have a relationship with him in which we have regular conversations together. And all of a sudden, I started imagining how cool it would be to have conversations with God. Like conversations in which he talked to me and not just me talking to him. And like I said, it felt too good to be true. But Samuel Williamson's words, they had me. And I continued to devour anything I could get my hands on to find out if it was possible to actually have a conversational relationship with my God, who I loved. The most helpful resources to me, and ones that I'll refer to throughout today's episode, are the following. First, Samuel Williamson's book, Hearing God in Conversation, a phenomenal book by Dallas Willard, simply called Hearing God. A book by Keith Anderson called The Spirituality of Listening, and then a book by John Eldredge called Walking with God. I read these 4 books, and I realized that all 4 of these authors talked as if they heard from God on a regular basis. You know, I'm reading these books, and they're talking as if hearing from God is something that happens for them, like regularly. And my envy went through the roof. I mean, I got so filled with longing for what these authors had. And what was worse is that in all the books, they quoted a bunch of other Christians throughout the centuries who also heard from God on a regular basis, like had conversations with God. And I began to hope. I began to wonder, what if this could be true for me? What if God would talk to me? Like, how cool would that be? I was 41 years old before I realized that I could have conversations with God. This means that I was a Christian for 30 years before I began to taste of the sweet fruit of asking God questions and hearing God respond. Why did it take me 30 years? more than one reason, but here's one of them. No one had ever told me that it was available. I was taught that God gave us the Bible, and everything God wanted to say to me was in the Bible. It was like the Bible was God's love letter to me. He mailed it to me, and then he just went away, leaving me to make what I could of it. But then I read the following words from Dallas Willard. And again, I couldn't find any holes in the logic. This is what Dallas Willard says. He says, people are meant to live in an ongoing conversation with God, speaking and being spoken to. Let me say it again. People are meant to live in an ongoing conversation with God, speaking and being spoken to. And Willard continues, God's visits to Adam and Eve in the garden, Enoch's walks with God, and the face-to-face conversations between Moses and God. These are all commonly regarded as highly exceptional moments in the religious history of humankind. However, they are not meant to be exceptional at all. Rather, they are examples of the normal human life God intended for us. And when I read Dallas Willard's words, when I read those words, I was like, yeah, all those places in the Bible where God talks to people, and there are a lot of them. I mean, a lot. I just assumed those were highly exceptional moments in history. And then Willard has the audacity to make a simple claim. He says, they're not meant to be exceptional at all. Rather, they are examples of the normal human life God intended for us. And boom, hope started surging in me. Envy started surging. I began to wonder, does Dallas Willard actually talk to God like I talk to my wife, Caroline? I mean, could conversation with my God be possible the way it's possible with my wife? And for a moment, let's just step back and realize the absurdity of all this. I mean, number one, God created words. He created words and ears. He created ears. God created the idea of a relationship in which you talk to a friend and your friend talks back and you grow in intimacy with each other. This is God's idea. And number three, we somehow think it's ludicrous that the God who created words, ears, and relationships would speak to us on a regular basis. The whole point of the work of Jesus in his incarnation, death, resurrection, and ascension is so that you and I can be reunited in a real love relationship with God. The point is union with God, connection with God, oneness with God. Remember, you and I are created in the image of a triune God. We are made for deep, intimate relationship with God. This intimacy is what Jesus is speaking about in the middle of the Gospel of John. I mean, listen to Jesus' words in John 14. He says this, "If you love me, you will obey what I command, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another counselor to be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. The world cannot accept him because it neither sees him nor knows him, but you know him." Now listen to this. "For he lives with you and will be in you." John 14. Now what's Jesus saying? He's saying that the counselor, the Spirit of God, will live in you and be in you. That's awfully intimate language. I mean, in John 14, Jesus goes on to say, "If anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him." Make our home with him. Now, commenting on this verse, Willard says the following, and again, the logic just makes sense. He says, "Surely this abiding of the Son and the Father in the faithful heart involves conscious communication or conversation. It is simply beyond belief that two persons so intimately related as indicated in Jesus' words would not speak explicitly to one another." Dallas Willard. And when I read that, I was like, it is beyond belief. I mean, the union that Jesus talks about in the Gospel of John, I'd read it. I'd read about this my whole life. I'd read this many, many times. The abiding, the idea of Jesus and the Father coming to me and making their home in me, the Spirit of God residing in me, it is simply beyond belief that this kind of intimacy would not involve reciprocal communication. Here's the point. Conversational intimacy with your God is not only possible, it's how you're designed. It's what you're made for. It's what God is interested in restoring in you. Union with him, intimacy with him. That's the point. And the height of union, the height of connection, of intimacy is conversation, a deep, intimate sharing. Here's Willard one more time. He says, union with God consists chiefly in a conversational relationship with God, while we are consistently and deeply engaged as his friend and co-laborer in the affairs of the kingdom of the heavens. God has created us for intimate friendship with himself. Now think about one of your close friends for a minute. Think about having a deep, rich conversation with this friend. How cool would it be if you could have regular conversations like that with your God? The way you have conversations with one of your close friends. The basis of any normal relationship is talking and listening. Talking and listening. In Samuel Williamson's book that I referenced earlier, Hearing God in Conversation, chapter 2 is titled, Conversation is the Point. I love that title. Conversation is the point. And this is what Williamson says. He says, look, if our best memories of our earthly fathers are of conversations rather than sermons, why do we think our Heavenly Father mostly wants to lecture us? We think we need step-by-step guidance, but mostly we need conversation. And really, why would we want it any other way? Samuel Williamson. Mostly we need conversation. And why would we want it any other way? I mean, when I thought about my relationship with God, I thought, yes, I need guidance. And boy, I long for guidance. But mostly what I need conversation. I need relationship. I need connection. I need reciprocal words shared, received, spoken. Okay, I want to talk for a bit. That was my plea. That was my plea for a hearing, for you to consider that hearing from God is possible. Now I want to talk for a bit about obstacles to hearing from God. I mean, if this is really possible, what gets in the way? The thing that got in the way for me for 30 years was that I assumed God wouldn't talk to me the way my wife talks to me. And therefore, I would never take the time to listen. I just didn't believe it was possible. I had a belief that God stopped talking after the Bible. I had such a longing to hear from God. And when I would hear others say, God told me this or God told me that, I would just get filled with envy because I so wanted to have that kind of close intimacy with God where God would actually talk to me. Some people have the sense, and I certainly did, that God has more important things to do than to talk to little old me. I mean, that's the sentiment. We say to ourselves, of course God talked to Paul or Elijah or Moses, but those were like really important people, and I'm not that important. Please, you are that important to God. You are important enough for Jesus to die for. If that's true, and it is, then it goes to follow that you are important enough for God to attune to you, to speak to you, to respond to you, to have conversation with you. So once you are open to the possibility that God actually wants to have conversations with you, once you're open to that, what can get in the way of actually hearing? Let me put it this way. My Christian life has been far richer these past 4 years since 2015 as a result of this category and as a result of this experience of hearing from God. I mean, it's incomparable, but it has been a hard-fought battle. It's been a hard-fought battle, and I don't think I'm alone in this. Few things have been a bigger struggle for me than learning how to hear from God. I can't tell you how many of my personal counseling sessions with my therapist have been about my struggle hearing from God, and how many wars have raged in my heart as I would go and take time to listen to God, and I would hear nothing, or I would begin to feel accusations against me, or begin to feel immense powerlessness. I mean, whenever there was movement towards just silence and listening to God, all sorts of stuff would start flying around. And the powerlessness of feeling like God's not going to talk to me, or I would just get overwhelmed with exhaustion. I wouldn't be able to keep my eyes open. So there's what gets in the way. Okay, one big thing that gets in the way for many of us, it's not going to come as a surprise, is our story. And more specifically, our family of origin story. One of the reasons that hearing from God is so fraught for many of us is because it connects us to our longing to hear our father and mother's voice growing up. Let me repeat that to let it sink in. One of the reasons that hearing from God is so fraught is because when we make movement towards listening, it connects us immediately to our longing to hear from our father or to hear from our mother when we were growing up. Have you come to terms with how deeply you longed to hear your father's voice as a boy or a girl? How deeply you longed to hear him speak into your life? Are you aware that as a little boy or girl, you deeply needed the strong and tender voice of your mother to speak into your heart good and strong words? If we let ourselves feel our longing to hear God's voice, that automatically connects us to very deep longings in our heart for attunement, responsiveness, and engagement from our parents. When you sit alone with God and invite God to speak to you about something that's important to you, it's as if you are back on your bed after a particularly hard day of school and you are needing someone to come sit on the edge of your bed and help you make sense of the world and what's happening to you and to give you good, strong words that nourish your heart. What was it like for you on your bed at night after a hard day? Was there conversation from an attuned, responsive, and engaged parent? Was your heart taken seriously, or were you left to your own devices to try to figure it all out? If you didn't have an attuned, responsive, and engaged parent, what do you think happens in your brain when you sit down to be with your heavenly parent and you are needing help, and you are needing words, and you are needing responsiveness and engagement from your God? The very act of sitting down to listen to God immediately connects you to all this unmet longing and heartache and loneliness. So of course it's fraught. Of course it's fraught. Okay, that's one obstacle. Next obstacle. A man named Tony Stoltzfus wrote a book called The Invitation, and there's a sentence in that book that has helped me. I haven't read the whole book. I don't even think I read more than the introduction. But there is a sentence in the introduction that has helped me more than anything else in my journey of learning to hear from God. And here's the sentence. I'll say it and then I'll unpack it. Tony says, "The problem is not that Jesus isn't speaking, or even that you aren't hearing. It's that you don't believe you are hearing." Let me say it again. The problem is not that Jesus isn't speaking, or even that you aren't hearing. It's that you don't believe you are hearing. This has been so profound for me. Tony's saying, look, you think the problem, and I did, is that God just isn't speaking. But that's not it. That's not it. He is. He's speaking. The nature of God is that God loves to talk. God loves to speak. And then Tony's saying, look, you think the problem is, I just must not be listening well. And that's why I can't hear from God. And Tony's saying, no, that's not even the problem. You're actually hearing also. God's speaking. and you're hearing. So what's the problem? It's that I don't believe that I'm hearing from God. Now, let me unpack this. Again, I have no idea if this applies to anyone else, but this was huge for me. Here's what would happen. As I began to take time to listen to God and began asking God questions, God would speak. And as soon as he did, I would hear the words, and then I would immediately dismiss them by saying, oh, that had to be my own thoughts rather than God's voice. That had to just come from within me. That had to be me. The problem was not that Jesus wasn't speaking. The problem wasn't even that I wasn't hearing. The problem was that I didn't believe it was actually God speaking to me. I would invariably dismiss what I heard by saying, oh, that's just coming from me. It's not really God. We get obsessed with the question of, is this God's voice or is this just my own thoughts? And here's how Dallas Willard addresses this question. This is from his book titled Hearing God. And boy, was this helpful for me. He says, we make this hard because we want proof that what we heard is really God. We may mistakenly think that if God spoke to us, we would automatically know who is speaking without having to learn. But that is simply a mistake, and one of the most harmful mistakes for those trying to hear God's voice. Let me read it again. He says, we may mistakenly think that if God spoke to us, we would automatically know who is speaking. But that's simply a mistake, and one of the most harmful mistakes for those trying to hear God's voice. I was operating under the assumption that if God spoke to me, I would automatically and without question know that it was God. There wouldn't be any doubt about it. And since I was questioning whether I heard God's voice or not, or whether it was just my own thoughts, I figured it must not be God, because if it were God, I'd know for sure, without a doubt. And Willard comes along and has the audacity to simply say, that's a mistaken assumption. That's a mistaken assumption. And he continues by saying, here's a quote, the only answer to the question, how do we know whether this is from God, is by experience. By experience. Hearing from God is something that you learn over time by experience. Just like anything else in life. Just like anything else in life, recognizing God's voice is something that we must learn to do through personal experience and experimentation. Being uncertain doesn't mean you haven't heard. This isn't an exact quote from John. By the way, John Eldredge has been so helpful. If you want more about this, I would highly recommend going over to Ransomed Hearts. I think it's ransomedheart.com, his ministry, because Eldredge, more than anyone else, has opened up the floodgates for me on the beauty and the possibility of hearing God's voice. And this isn't an exact quote from him, but this is basically what he says. He says, look, all significant skills and abilities in life require repeated practice to learn how to do them well. Why would it be any different with learning to hear God's voice? That has been such a freeing concept for me. I'm in process. I'm learning. And Eldredge is saying, look, everything that you've learned in life that's actually valuable, that's significant, you've had to learn it through a process of repeated practice. Where is the place we find ourselves? The place we find ourselves is living in a world where God is training us to reign over our kingdom. It is a process of training. We are in the process of growing up. God is growing us up as sons and daughters to rule over the creation. And part of being trained to reign over your kingdom, frankly, a very big part of being trained, is learning how to hear the voice of God, your King. But it's a process. You get better at it over time. Okay, another obstacle. Some of us don't feel the freedom to just waltz right into God's presence and begin talking with him and expecting him to talk back. I have a journal where I write down everything God says to me. It's a journal of learning to hear the voice of God. And on May 28th of 2015, I have an entry that says this: one of the hindrances to hearing from God is that I don't feel the freedom to just ask God about stuff the way my son would with me. When I turn to speak to my Heavenly Father, I don't have a sense of God saying, "Oh, it's my son Adam. I'm so excited he's talking to me." Instead, I feel this sense of I can't just barge into God's presence and start talking to him. This is about attachment. If you didn't develop a secure attachment to your parents, chances are you are not going to be securely attached to your God. And so you may have this sense that God's too busy for you, or God's too majestic and holy for you to just barge into his presence and talk. So that's an obstacle. One more common obstacle, and then we will look at some practical ways to begin to learn to hear God's voice. Another obstacle to hearing God's voice is that we are not attuned to the gentle stillness of God's voice. In 1 Kings 19, God's voice is heard. And the way the text reads, it says that God was not in the earthquake. He was not in the fire. But then it says, after the fire came a still, small voice. And here's how Dallas Willard comments on this passage. He says, the translation might just as well read a gentle whispering instead of a still, small voice. Willard continues, the expression places the emphasis on the unobtrusiveness of the medium through which the message comes. Messages from God are seemingly unremarkable, inconspicuous, unassuming, and perhaps not easily noticed. The medium through which the message comes is diminished almost to the vanishing point, taking the form of thoughts that are our thoughts, though these thoughts are not from us. God's spiritual invasions into human life seem, by their very gentleness, to invite us to explain them away. That's Dallas Willard. One obstacle to hearing God's voice is that the nature of God's voice is often so unobtrusive, so quiet and gentle. It's what 1 Kings 19 is getting at when it says a still, small voice. And Willard is saying, look, that's not easily noticed, particularly when we're wanting skywriting, when we're wanting something loud, but God's voice is often quiet. And then Willard adds this part, and it's so important. It takes the form of thoughts that are our thoughts, though these thoughts are not from us. Okay, let's end with some practical steps to take to begin to learn to hear how to hear from God. Number one, and boy is this important, there has to be a kindness and a patience with your heart here. If it is hard for you to hear from God, as it has been for me, why not be curious about why that is? Breakthrough for me has come gradually over time as I explored with my therapist what it was in my story that made it hard for me to hear from God. It's so easy to collapse in hopelessness when we long for something like God's voice and we can't seem to get it. There has to be a patience with your heart here, a kindness with your heart, and a curiosity about what is it that might be keeping you from hearing from God. Because again, the nature of God is that God speaks all the time. Number two, take seriously Jesus' words that you are in him and his spirit is in you. I mean, read the Gospel of John, read the New Testament. What you'll find is that God not only sent Jesus, but sent his spirit. And where has God sent his spirit? Into your heart and my heart. Now, let me ask a simple question. Do you believe that? Are you aware that the Spirit of God actually resides in you? This is what Willard's getting at earlier. And here's him saying it a little bit differently. In the union of the believer with God, their two beings are unified and inhabit each other, just as Jesus prayed. This is from John 17. Jesus prays, I ask that they may all be one. As you, Father, are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us. That's John 17. Now, Willard continues and he simply says this, in this way, we are addressed by God, spoken to by God through our own thoughts. He's getting at the union, the connection, the oneness and intimacy that occurs between the Spirit of God and the child of God. And it is what enables us to hear God, oftentimes through our own thoughts. But as Willard puts it, the thoughts are not from us. It is the still small voice of God. Now, number 3, start small. Start small. I will ask God simple questions like, what would you like to say to me today? And he'll say simple things like, I love you. Practice asking simple questions and then see what wells up in your heart and mind in the next minute or two. It may be words, it may be an image, it may just be a sense of God present with you in a particular way. Ask questions like, God, what are you delighting in me about today? Where have you enjoyed me today? How have you been loving me recently, even today? And then listen. As I thumb through my journal of learning to hear from God, where I write down everything that God says to me, the most common sentence in that journal, by far, the most common thing that God has said to me, if you look in the journal and you thumb through it, the sentence that you're going to see over and over and over is, I love you. I mean, it's all over the place. Different dates, different color pens. It's on like every other page. Ask simple questions and then remember those words from Tony Stoltzfus earlier. The problem isn't that God isn't speaking. The problem isn't even that you're not hearing. The problem may be that you don't believe that you're hearing. Sometimes God's words can be playful and rather surprising. One time I walked into the woods to pray. This was probably a year or two ago. Walked into the woods to pray. That I knew there was like a chair there, and I sat down in the chair and I closed my eyes. And then God said quite kindly and playfully, why would you close your eyes? I mean, it was just the strangest thing. And God's point was, there's all this beauty around me and I'm closing my eyes. Sometimes God's words will be disorienting, surprising. One time I was listening to God and I was simply frustrated. And I said to God, I so long to hear your voice and there's only silence. And then the sentence that came was simply, you hear from me more often than you think you do. And I knew it was God. You hear from me more often than you think you do. The sentence had more weight to it than the normal thoughts of my mind. That's how you can, that's a helpful way to distinguish your own thoughts from the voice of God. There is a weightiness. It's like the sentence is asterisked or it's italicized. It just has a different weight to it than the other thoughts that course through your day or through your mind throughout the day. And the fourth and final thing that I want to say is that you will learn to recognize the nature of God's voice more and more over time. In Samuel Williamson's book, Hearing God in Conversation, he has a chapter called How Can I Know It's God's Voice? And he says this, there is a feel to the voice of God that we learn to recognize. It simply takes time and experience. The more we hear his voice, the more we recognize it. This is what Jesus is getting at in John 10 when he says, my sheep know my voice. My sheep know my voice. There is a character to the voice of God. That character is endlessly kind. It is never accusatory. It will not run over your will or bully you. It is always inviting and kind. When I read that sentence about how can I know it's God's voice from hearing God in conversation, what I thought about is, it's just like my daughter Hope and I. Hope knows my voice. And I don't mean the sound of it. I mean, she knows the way I talk to her. I have a personality. She knows my Adamness. So if one of Hope's friends came to her and said, "Your dad told me that he thinks you're too sensitive," her first thought is going to be, that doesn't sound like something my dad would say. Why? Because I've blessed her sensitivity dozens and dozens of times, and with great authority. She knows my voice. She knows how I am postured towards her, and she knows the kindness of my voice toward her heart. The voice of God to you is always kind, and it is always inviting. And there is a certain peace and unhurriedness to the voice of God. If having conversation with God is not a regular part of your life, may it begin to be a place for you to be curious and to experiment with. In John 14, Jesus says, "If anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him." And reflecting on that, Willard simply says this: it is simply beyond belief that two persons so intimately related would not speak explicitly to one another. Conversation with God is available to you, his child. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Place We Find Ourselves. Again, if season 2 has been helpful to you, please head over to my website, adamyoungcounseling.com, and consider clicking on support the podcast. I would deeply appreciate it. I will see you in 2 weeks with a new episode.